Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So this is our third installment on the series about early Buddhist history. In the last talk, I spoke about the first and second councils, which were very formative events in early Buddhism. And the first council establishing the canon, and the second council representing the first division or split in Buddhism, the split between the Sthaviravada and the Mahasamgikas. And in the subsequent centuries, both of these main schools tended to proliferate further, and even before the arising of Mahayana, there were traditionally said to be 18 separate schools of Buddhism in India, but this number is really an underestimate. We can find at least 25 or 30 names of schools. Now, this whole area of discussion is very uncertain, and there's a lot of scholarly debate around the details. Nothing is, or very little is really known for certain about any of it. One of the problems is the paucity of our sources. Out of these original schools, the only one surviving today is the Theravada. And as we'll see in the subsequent talks, the history of the Theravada is not so simple as to say it's simply the original root stock. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. The only complete or close to complete canon we have for any of these schools are two, the Theravada and the Sarvastivada. We have only fragments of the other schools. And in many cases, we only know them from the words of their adversaries. Two of our main sources for the doctrines of the different schools are the Theravadan text Katawatu, which is the last book of the Abhidhamma, added at the time of the Third Council under King Asoka. And this book is like a debate manual, bringing up the various points of doctrine that are raised by schools outside of Theravada, and giving sample debates of how a monk could refute these doctrines. A similar source from the Sarvastivada side is the Vibhasa, which is in part of the Vibhasa has a similar sort of theme to the Katawatu, in that it deals with the doctrines of schools differing from the Sarvastivada. So a lot of our information about all the rest of the schools comes from these two sources. So we only know about them from their adversaries, so to speak. Another issue is we have to understand what is meant in this context, in the context of Buddhist history, by a school. It's not exactly the same thing as in Christianity, say, where we talk about all the different denominations of Protestantism that are clearly defined separate communities. There's a lot of, in the Buddhist schools, they weren't always even adversaries to each other. Chinese pilgrims who traveled in India later would often report that there would be monasteries with monks mixed of different schools of thought, holding a common community but having separate teachings. Part of what's going on here is that there is a separate transmission of Dhamma and Vinaya. So although the only surviving school from these days is Theravada in both Dhamma and Vinaya, there still survives today the Vinaya of the Dharmaguptakas, which was taken up in China and East Asia generally, and the Vinaya of the Mulasarvastivadins, which is practiced in Tibet. So even though in both cases, they've developed Mahayana or Vajrayana doctrines and established different schools of doctrine, they're holding to the original Vinaya transmission out of India from these original schools. So with these basic caveats in mind, and remembering that all of this material is rather uncertain and subject to controversy about details, let's look at some of the major schools and divisions and how they arose. As we talked about in the last installment, the first split was between the Sthaviravada, and that name is simply the Sanskrit version of Theravada. It's the school of the elders, and the Mahasamgika, which is the big group or the majority group. This is what the name means. And this dates to the period of the Second Council. To recapitulate, at the Second Council, it was decided to retain the original Vinaya, but many of the monks were not happy with this. And 37 years later, they held another council at Pataliputra. And at that time, the council broke up without coming to a conclusion and resulted in two separate communities of monks, the Sthaviravada and the Mahasamgikas. And the controversy at this council was not over Vinaya, but over the so-called 5 points of Mahadeva, which we talked about last time. Mahadeva had proposed 5 propositions that amounted to a diminution of the status of an arahant. That an arahant was not a perfected being. He was subject to various flaws. He was subject to ignorance. He was subject to having nocturnal emissions and subject to falling away. All of this is contrary to the orthodox doctrine. So those monks who accepted Mahadeva's 5 points became the Mahasamgikas. And the other monks who held to the original doctrine retained the name of Sthaviravada. And both of these schools subsequently split and fractured further. The Mahasamgikas are generally considered to be the ancestors or precursors of the Mahayana. And some of their doctrines that they developed definitely have a very Mahayana flavor. For example, I'm reading from the book The Buddhist Sects of the Lesser Vehicle by André Barrault, 1955, about the Mahasamgika doctrine. Because the Buddha, with his mind of benefited beings, is never surfeited, he does not enter into nirvana. His compassion, karuna, is limitless, his longevity is infinite. If there are beings to whom it is suitable that the Buddha should manifest his miracles and bliss of his quietude, he is born into the royal palace, etc. He accomplishes the awakening bodhi, he converts and guides those beings. If there are beings to whom it is suitable to manifest the stopping of causality, he fictitiously, nirmana, enters into nirvana. Since his mind is not surfeited, He abides in the form of a body of enjoyment, Sambhogakaya, until the end of time. He creates, nimitta, forms adapted to different kinds of beings and teaches by means of skillful means, upaya. So they were turning the Buddha into a kind of godlike figure, that the Buddha is not a real flesh and blood human being, but he manifests a nimitta, a form on the earth, which they term Sambhogakaya, which is a precursor of the developed ideas in Mahayana Buddhism of the three bodies of the Buddha, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. So that concept arose quite early on amongst the Mahasamgikas. So the Buddha was becoming, in their interpretation, the Buddha was becoming a kind of a celestial or divine being who only manifested in an illusory form on the earth to teach beings. So this is quite different from the traditional view and the Theravada view to this day, that Siddhartha Gautama was an actual flesh and blood human being who attained to supreme enlightenment. So this, of course, was a completely irreconcilable difference of opinion, and the two schools went their separate ways. To talk about the Sthaviravada and further developments in the Sthaviravada first, they split again early on, and it's debatable which was the first major split, but it seems like it very likely was a split between the root of the Sthaviravada and the breakaway group, the Sarvastivada. And some accounts date this to the third council of Asoka, which I'll talk about more in the next installment. But in brief, the Sarvastivada are actually pretty close doctrinally to the Theravada, but they have a number of different points, and the one that seems to have been the most controverted was the Sarvastivada doctrine of the three times. The name Sarvastivada means all exists, and they held a theory that past, present, and future all have an equal ontological status. They all exist, and it's only our perception or our consciousness that perceives the present moment, but the three times are actually all existent. This was denied by Sthaviravada, who held, as the Theravada do to this day, that only the present moment is actually real. Past and the future are have either not come into being or have ceased to be. And a thought of the past, for example, a memory, is not a perception of any real thing, but just that an image generated in the mind. The Sarvastivada became a very prominent school in northern India, particularly in the northwest. And when we encounter, for example, Tibetan writings that talk about the Hinayana, as they call it, it's the Sarvastivada doctrines that they're referencing. It seems that the Tibetans only knew the Sarvastivada or offshoots of the Sarvastivada. They were also the first school that we know of to put the Buddhist writings into the Sanskrit language. Prior to that time, the Buddhists would retain their doctrines in what are called prakrits, that is, vernaculars derived from Sanskrit, or like Pali that the Theravada uses, is a derivative of Sanskrit. It could be classed as a prakrit, except that it was probably never an actual vernacular, but it was kind of a simplified Sanskrit. it was felt by the Sarvastivadins that writing in Sanskrit gave them more of a kind of a scholarly or authoritative feel to their doctrines. The Saviravada at this time, the main group, we should no longer even really use that term. This is another point of confusion here. At the third council, they were called the Vibhajyavadins, or the school of analysis. And there are different interpretations of what this actually meant or referred to. But the one that seems to make the most sense is that it was in distinction to the Sarvastivada. The Sarvastivada said everything exists. The Vibhajyavadins said, no, we discriminate between past, present, and future. So the Vibhajyavadins were the holders of the traditional or orthodox doctrine at this point. And there were further splits. The Sautrantikas, another important school that split off from the Sarvastivada, and they were particularly known for denying the value of the Abhidhamma and holding to the sutras only. And they developed some peculiar doctrines that were tending towards personalism. They held that the 5 aggregates actually migrate from life to life. Another school, the Vatsiputriya, took this even further, and they're sometimes called the Pudgalavadins. Pudgala means the person, and a lot of the controversies in the Katawatu reference this school and their various divisions, because they continued splitting as well. But their principal idea was that there is a person outside the 5 aggregates. So these various schools were moving away from the central idea of Buddhism of emptiness or anatta. They were postulating some kind of real person that transmigrates. The Mula Sarvastivadins, another split off the Sarvastivadins. The Mula means root. They were actually the branch that was probably known by the Tibetans. They were a subgroup of the Sarvastivadins, and it's their Vinaya that survives in Tibetan Buddhism. The Vibhajyavadins, I mentioned already, they were the ancestors of the Theravada, and they took this name at the Third Council to distinguish themselves from the Sarvastivada. The Mahisasakas was an early split off of these. They are very close in their ideas to the Theravada. They only differ from the Theravada in some very minor points of Abhidhamma and definitions of terms and so on. Nothing of really great significance, although this was also characteristic of the period, that very small, minute, hair-splitting points could become the reason for splitting off and establishing a separate school. They were also present in Sri Lanka early on. So Theravada did not have exclusive domain in Sri Lanka in the beginning. There were some of these other early schools also had a presence there. One of the branches of the Mahasasakas became very important later is the Dharmaguptakas. And they were originally based very far away from the south. They were originally based in Gandhara, which is in Afghanistan now. And they are mostly known for the extensive missionary work that they carried on outside of India. And they proselytized Buddhism into East Asia. And so they were a major influence in China, in getting Buddhism into China. So their Vinaya, the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, is that which survives in China and East Asia generally. And the Bhikkhuni lineage, which has now been reestablished, traces its ordinations back through the Dharmaguptaka. So these are some of the major branches of the Sthaviravada. And the picture is more complicated than this survey would indicate. There were many other minor schools, and some schools are hard to classify as whether they belong to the Sthaviravada or the Mahasamgika. Now, turning to the Mahasamgika, they too continue to split as centuries went by. And as we said, they were originally founded on the point of the 5 principles of Mahadeva, which downgraded the status of an arahant and elevated the status of a Buddha. One of their branches was the Lokuttaravadins, which means the transcendental school. And they are the branch that was established in the Northwest. And for example, the famous Buddhist statues at Bamiyan in Afghanistan that the Taliban blew up, they were probably built by adherents of this school. They emphasized further the transcendental nature of the Buddha, and they were one of the first schools to accept some of the Mahayana sutras. In particular, the early sutra, the Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is one, if not the earliest, is one of the earliest Mahayana sutras. And they incorporated that into their canon. The Gokalikas was another branch of the Mahasamgikas, and they were the opposite of the Sautrantikas we discussed earlier. The Gokalikas held that only the Abhidhamma was of value, and the sutras were only very lower grade sort of teaching fables. They weren't important. And they held that logic and reasoning was very important in the development. And they also did not fully accept the authority of the Vinaya and felt that they could kind of make up their own rules. So we kind of see, again, here something that is known later, that many of the Mahayana traditions disregarded parts of the Vinaya that were inconvenient. Finally, a very important school in terms of the development of Theravada, because this is the school that the Theravadins in Sri Lanka were probably most in contact with. These were the Andakas, who were probably the same as another school that is referred to as the Chaitakas. This is another problem in that the names, different sources will have different names for the same school. But if they were 2 separate schools, they were actually very close in their ideas. And they also had some proto-Mahayanist tendencies. For example, the emphasis on the Bodhisattvayana, the Bodhisattva path, which is characteristic of the Mahayana. This became introduced amongst the Andakas. They also had a teaching about something they called the Mula Vijnana, the root consciousness, which seems to have been the origin of the doctrine in Yogacara, which was a fully Mahayana school, of the Alaya Vijnana, that is the storehouse consciousness. This is a characteristic, important doctrine of the Yogacara, that there is a kind of a layer of consciousness in which the seeds of Kama are stored. The criticism of this is that it tends towards the idea of some kind of immortal or abiding essence in a being, which is contrary to the idea of anatta or emptiness. They would deny this. They have ways of interpreting it. But from outside, it's the way it seems. So these are the major schools, and as I said, there are many more. There are some rather colorful accounts that have come down to us about how some of these schools arose. There's one school that's called Bahusrutriya, and according to their own account that has come down to us, it was founded by an Arahant bhikkhu who during the lifetime of the Buddha traveled north into the Himalayas to practice meditation and went into jhana for 200 years. And then at the end of 200 years, when he emerged from jhana and returned to the populated areas in India, and he encountered monks and spoke with them, he was shocked to discover that many of the more transcendental teachings of the Buddha had been forgotten. And so he restored the original teachings of the Buddha. And this is the claim of this school. So we have a very complex picture, and the details are always not clear. But what I think is important in this picture for an understanding of later developments is that there were three Vinaya traditions that survived. One was the Theravada, which survived via Sri Lanka, and we'll see that in a subsequent talk, how that the importance of Sri Lanka in this history, that Sri Lanka was really, and actually one monastery in Sri Lanka, the Mahavihara, was the source of all modern-day Theravadins. The Mula Sarvastivada, which was a branch of the Sarvastivadis that was prominent in the northwest, like in Kashmir, and found their way eventually into Tibet, or their Vinaya at least, found its way into Tibet and still survives to this day. And the Dharmaguptaka, which sent missionaries into China and established a tradition in China that although the monks over time switched to Mahayana, began reading and incorporating Mahayana sutras and doctrines, they retained the original Vinaya. So the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya remains in place in East Asia. And it's that ordination lineage through Dharmaguptaka that is behind the modern Bhikkhuni lineage, because the Bhikkhuni lineage died out in Theravada and in Mula Sarvastivada. It's only the Dharmaguptaka lineage. The other important point here is to bear in mind the fundamental divisions in all this kind of proliferation of schools. The most important divisions historically was, first of all, the split between the Stavyaravada and the Mahasamgikas, because the Stavyaravadis eventually became the Theravadas, and the Mahasamgikas eventually became the Mahayana. But the Stavyaravada also had an important split early on between the Vibhajavadins and the Sarvastivadins. And the Vibhajavadins are the ones who eventually found their way into Sri Lanka. And became the Theravadins. And they were considered the orthodox tradition at the time of the Third Council, and the Sarvastivadins were the, although they were, again, this is another echo of the Second Council and the Council of Pataliputra, because the Sarvastivadins were probably at that time in the majority. They were a very prevalent school, but the influence of King Asoka may have tipped the scales, and the Vibhajavadins were recognized as the orthodox tradition. And all these schools were operating in India from the time of the Second Council, when the proliferations began, and they increased after the Third Council under Asoka, all the way down to the time of Buddhaghosa in roughly the 5th century AD. So we're now more than 1,000 years from the time of the Buddha. And at that time, there was already not only a proliferation of these schools, but there also had arisen this entirely new Mahayana. One of the historical problems that's not resolved, and there's a lot that's not resolved in this period, the sources are contradictory and inadequate, but one of the mysteries is really where and when and how the Mahayana came in to the picture. Because we have, for example, texts from Buddhaghosa's time where in Buddhaghosa's commentaries and in other contemporaries, there was considerable criticism of the various other schools, and even of some philosophical traditions outside of Buddhism, like Sankhya and Vedanta. But there doesn't seem to be any direct, clear mention of Mahayana as a separate tradition. Now, one theory is that the Mahayana at this time was known to have existed probably from the 1st century BC, was probably limited to one small area in south central India that was something of a backwater. It was off the main trade routes, and so it was little known. And the monks who lived there were not in much contact with the broader currents in India, so they were sort of free to indulge in wild speculation and go, completely off the reservation. Of course, we know Mahayana later became very powerful and influential in India and elsewhere. And this whole history of these schools, as obscure as it is, it does illustrate the first of all, the very human tendency of religions to split and divide. We know that all religions follow this kind of pattern, that they'll divide on points of doctrine and then get further and further apart. But it also illustrates a peculiarly Indian, I think, habit of mind, of the love of philosophic speculation that characterized Indian civilization, and the love of debate and learned disputes on very minor points. If we read some of these accounts of the different doctrines of the different schools, although there are some really major divergences, like the nature of a Buddha, the nature of an Arahant, and whether a person exists or not, most of the controversies were actually over very minute, obscure, hair-splitting points of interpretation of Abhidhamma. And it's very difficult for a modern person even to enter into that mindset and appreciate the importance they put on these tiny points. It seems that the Abhidhamma, as a separate Pitaka, was a later development than the suttas. We have seen that the Abhidhamma was not spoken at the first council, but it was spoken at the third council under Asoka, and the Katawatu was added at that time. And what we have the Abhidhamma of the Sarvastivadis, and we have some partial Abhidhammas from some of the other schools preserved in Chinese or Tibetan translation. And what we find is a much greater divergence. The Sutta Pitakas that survive in different recensions, like the Chinese Agamas, which are probably the Dharmaguptaka texts translated into Chinese, and some of the Sanskrit texts that have been found, they're quite a large degree of agreement that everyone seemed to have the same Sutta Pitaka. But the Abhidhamma is all over the place, quite different. Abhidharmas is the Sanskrit, which most of them used. The Abhidharmas were quite different from one school to another. And it seems that they were probably developed in a sense as manifestos of the different schools, as a way of stating their position. Like, this is how we interpret things, taken to a very minute level. Here we understand this and that these factors are associated with these factors. This is the cause of this is the cause of that. And everything taken down to a very fine point of analysis. And the differences between the different schools were expressed primarily in their Abhidharmas. So that is a survey of the various schools of Buddhism, and what I propose to do for the next talk will be to look at the reign of Asoka and the third council. So I'll take my leave.